I was a part of an online gathering of pastors this week. And during that gathering of pastors, I heard one particular man make the comment that we can't just continue to wait out all of this. Whether we as a culture, a community, or a church will be able to return to the way things were before the coronavirus, or whether the world has simply changed and now we'll have to find a new normal. Either way, this pastor shared that he felt like we can't just keep hoping that if we wait long enough, then we can pretend like none of this ever happened. Instead, what we need to do is to ask, how do we continue to be who God has given us to be in the midst of all of this? Jeremiah 29:11 is one of those verses that everyone knows. And a lot of us have it printed on our coffee mugs or throw pillows or bathroom mirrors. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. What fewer of us know is what's going on in Israel when those words were written. Israel had been conquered by Babylon, and many of the faithful Hebrews had been carried off to exile by Nebuchadnezzar. And in Jeremiah chapter 29, we find a letter written by the hand of Jeremiah from God to his people in exile. In verse 11, we find this iconic statement that God has not forgotten them, and that he had plans for God's people to return to the land that he had promised their forefathers centuries before. But before God makes this iconic statement, he tells the people not to just stick their heads in the sand and try and wait this out. God tells his people not to sit around and wish that things were the way they used to be. Listen to what it is that God tells his people who have been hauled off into exile. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. God is telling his people, look, I know that this isn't what you ever would have wished for, but this is what I've given you. Embrace it. Worship me just like you would have in Jerusalem. Serve me just like you would have in Judea. And be a blessing to those around you just like you would have if you were free. Your circumstances have changed, but who you are has not changed. You are still mine. You are still my people. You are still my children. And I still want to use you to bless all of creation just like I always have. For the last few weeks, regardless of what I may have said to the contrary, I have been guilty of the sin of just wishing all this would go away so that we could be back here and go back to the way that things used to be. And over the last week, God has really convicted me of not continuing to lean into who he is and who I am in him and the purpose that he has for me in his kingdom today in the midst of all of this. And so last week, we reached out to some of our people here at LifePoint, and we asked for feedback about what we've been doing over the last few weeks to try and lead our LifePoint family to continue to be who God has made us to be in this community. And when we asked, we got feedback, and we listened. And as a result, you're going to be noticing some different things this weekend and in the weeks to come. Now, I wish I could tell you when we'll be back worshiping here in this building and what that will look like when it happens. But the truth is, I just don't know. But regardless of when that is, I want to encourage you to spend some time this week asking God to help you see this season not as an in-between time, not as a time to stick our heads in the sand and just hope that it will be over soon. In exile in Babylon, God's people had opportunities to be God's people in close proximity to Babylonians who may very well have never even heard of Yahweh God had the Israelites not had to spend so many decades in exile. And there are opportunities that you have right now to love and serve our community, to love and serve your own families, your own neighborhoods, your own apartment complexes, opportunities that you don't normally have. And just as the leadership of LifePoint has begun to pray and ask God to help us see this season not just as a test, not just as a struggle, as we've begun to pivot from asking questions like, how do we keep doing what we were doing before, to asking questions like, what opportunities do we have now that we didn't have before? I want to ask you to begin praying the same question. How might God want to use you in the midst of all this? Some of you have already been praying that question. And I want to thank those of you who have, because God has used some of you to help show me my own mistakes and errors in the past weeks. But for those who haven't yet begun to lean in to what God has given us in all of this, now is the time. This is the week. Today is the day.